Hey, what's up everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. I am very excited for the next half dozen or so episodes that I'm going to do because they cover the creation and the evolution and the institution of the United States Constitution, which is the piece of history, political science, sociology that I am probably most fascinated with. I really can't get enough of exploring the ways in which human societies are created, the way that governments operate, the way that all of that is structured, because I think it really helps to explain why societies are and why the world is as it is. And after all, the title of this podcast is How the Hell Did We Get Here? And that's kind of what I'm trying to help you and me understand. Perhaps the most important cog in that machine is the United States Constitution because it lays out the structure of our government, which then dictates a whole lot else about how the United States of America works. So I'm going to get into all that over the next few episodes. I'm going to talk about the first form of government the U.S. had, how we got away from that and toward the United States Constitution that we still have at the moment. But before I do all that, I'd like to ask you all to please like and subscribe. As you already know from listening to any other number of YouTubers and podcasters, it really does help the show get discovered, and that is fantastic for me. It enables me to do more of this. So if you have friends or family that would enjoy the show, in addition to liking and subscribing, if you wouldn't mind passing it along to them, man, would I appreciate that. I am very grateful to you. And to those of you that have already done it, thank you so much. I really enjoy doing this, and I very much hope that I keep getting to do more of it. I'm going to start this episode, as I have done with all the episodes so far, by laying out the resources that I'm using. They've changed a little bit for this episode, so I'm going to start there with those, and I'm going to lay out a question for y'all to think about as I go through the material. And the idea is that after I've gone through everything, you should be able to answer this question at length and speak or write intelligently about it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'll start with the resources because, as I said a moment ago, they've changed a little bit. I'm using some different stuff for the next few episodes. I'm still using the American Pageant, the AP US History textbook that I've talked about over and over again. Also, Give Me Liberty, I'm still using that. And those are kind of baselines for... They do a good job of laying out the basics for pretty much everything. Then there is The Glorious Cause, the American Revolution, 1763 to 1789 by Robert Middlecoff, which again is part of the Oxford History of the United States series. And then the two new books that I'm introducing in this episode and I'll be using for at least the next 5 or 6 are, first of all, Plain Honest Men, The Making of the American Constitution by Richard Beeman. And then secondly, Miracle at Philadelphia, The Story of the Constitutional Convention, May to September 1787 by Catherine Drinker Bowen. And that book has been around for a while. That was originally published in the 1960s. I want to say it was like 63, but that might be a little bit off. Both of those two books, as the title suggests, focus on the creation of the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention, the stuff that led up to the Constitutional Convention, the founding fathers who had a central role in the Constitutional Convention, and even some of the maybe peripheral figures who didn't have as big of a role but are important to know because they added this or that portion to the Constitution, or they advocated for having it ratified, or they were against it, and thus shaped the way that it would come out at the end. And then the question that you want to keep in mind as I go through this episode: what sort of government was created by the Articles of Confederation? And why did the Continental Congress end up bringing a government that looked like this into existence? I'll say that one more time. What sort of government was created by the Articles of Confederation? And why did the Continental Congress end up bringing a government that looked like this into existence? So that's what you want to think about as I'm going through this information. And as the question implies, I'm going to be discussing the circumstances of the United States immediately after the war, kind of just at the end of the Revolutionary War, and also what the Articles of Confederation looked like. So away we go. The United States, like many other countries that had just broken away from a larger empire or state, or had formed by bringing several different groups of people or previously existing states together, or whatever way it is that new states get formed. It happens in a lot of different ways. In the case of the United States, of course, it was breaking away from the British Empire. But what all of those states tend to have in common is that they are not in the best of shape as they are getting started. There are typically financial challenges. There's the Herculean task of getting the government up and running, where one probably didn't exist. Now, in the case of the United States, of course, you had the British government as a model, and you also had the various colonial governments as models. And so they weren't totally starting from scratch, but to bring all of these 13 separate little islands, as I have described them in previous episodes, which is really how they operated in the pre-revolutionary period and to some extent as the revolution was going on, to bring them all together was no mean feat. That was a very difficult thing to do. The founding fathers who were involved with ushering the revolution into being and carrying it out to fruition also had the task of designing a government as the war was happening that would try to bring all of these separate colonies together as one nation. It was tough going. I'll get into that in just a moment. I do want to describe, before I get into that, what I think is a pretty illustrative story of a major challenge that reared its head as the war was ending and before the peace had been concluded in Paris. And that is what is sometimes referred to as the Newburgh Conspiracy. And a little background, I have stated in a number of instances in the recent episodes on the Revolutionary War just how difficult, how hard things were for the Continental Army and for the militias that were fighting against the British. They were poorly supplied, not just in terms of the stuff that you need to fight the war, guns and knives and gunpowder and cannon and those kinds of things, but just in terms of clothes. I mentioned that at Valley Forge, for instance, a lot of the soldiers were dressed in literally like rags that they had sewn together. They did not have uniforms. A lot of times you'll see Revolutionary War soldiers on the American side wearing these sort of like blue and white uniforms. I mean, there were some troops and officers who had something that was like a formal uniform, but that was not the case with a very healthy number of the troops who fought in the revolution. They were just wearing whatever they could get their hands on, and very often they did not have winter coats. They did not have shoes. They're described, as I said, in multiple instances as being naked, and in addition to being deprived of clothing and the regular supplies that you need for fighting the war, they didn't have a lot of food to go on either, just enough to, as in one of the books that I read to put this episode together, keep the soul and body afloat, is how it was put. On top of all of that, at various periods, the soldiers were not paid for months on end, close to a year in some cases, from what I've read. And that is what is happening in 1781-82 as the war is winding down. Yorktown, the final victory really of the Americans and the French against the British in Virginia, had occurred in October of 1781. But as I've said, it wasn't until close to the end of the year in 1783 that the Treaty of Paris was actually signed between Britain and the United States. That's a lot of time to elapse, and that whole time that the peace is being negotiated, the soldiers are still serving, and so are the officers. Everybody is kind of just waiting around in limbo for this thing to end, and as they're waiting around in limbo for this thing to end, many of the soldiers are not being paid, many of the officers are not being paid. I've read descriptions of soldiers' families having to revert to begging in the streets of wherever it was that they lived, just so that they could survive, because they were not getting any money from the man of the house, who was typically the breadwinner at this time. Officers felt indignant, like their efforts were not being respected. And this is something that Washington complained about again and again to the Congress. First, the Continental Congress, and then when the Articles of Confederation went into effect, eventually the Confederation Congress. That happened in the late winter, March 3rd of 1781 is when the Articles of Confederation actually went into effect, because they were written in 1777, but it took many years for all of the states to sign on. Like I said, it was a tough road to hoe. A lot of these states really just wanted to go back to the way things were before the French and Indian War, which was all 13 of them kind of doing their own thing. The Confederation Congress and the Continental Congress did not really heed Washington's repeated requests for better supplies and payment and food and uniforms and everything else that he wanted his troops to get as the war went along. Another thing that the soldiers had been promised was a pension, which, for those of you that don't know, a pension is just a kind of perpetual payment that you receive. It doesn't have to be perpetual, I guess, exactly, but it's a payment that you receive for services rendered. I mean, today we have like Social Security, for instance, and that's a pension effectively that every American gets once you hit 65. It's just a set of payments that you get every month to cover your cost of living. Everybody puts into the system and you get it back. And in the case of the soldiers, and a lot of soldiers today, they have, a retirement pension. That wasn't necessarily guaranteed back in the 18th century, but it was something that Washington and a lot of the other officers pushed for the soldiers to have because of the sacrifices that they had made to win the country's independence. But Congress dithered on the pensions, on the pay, and so you had a lot of really upset, angry, irritated, disaffected soldiers in the Continental Army and in militias. And in the incident that I brought up a few minutes ago, the Newburgh incident, what happens is that in 1782, early 1783, this group of soldiers were holed up in this village at this barracks in Newburgh, New York. They were there under the command of a General Horatio Gates. Gates is one of the upper echelon commanding officers of the Continental Army, or at least he had been until his embarrassing defeat at Camden in 1780. He was the general that was the overall commanding officer at Saratoga. And from that point, from the Saratoga battle until his defeat at Camden, Gates was somebody that was vying for command, for authority with George Washington. And there was a cabal, it's sometimes referred to as the Conway Cabal, like group of kind of conspirators in the Continental Congress who were pushing for Gates and not Washington to be the head of the Continental Army after especially Saratoga happened, and it was this big victory that, of course, got France to sign on to an alliance with the United States. Washington, as you might imagine, picked up on this push to have him replaced and didn't appreciate it too much, and neither did a lot of the people around Washington, and neither did the supporters Washington had. There were many of them in the Continental Congress. Gates felt jealous of Washington, felt that he, Gates, deserved the command and not Washington. And that was kind of based on Gates' success, at least in overseeing Saratoga. He wasn't really the general in the field. That was more like Benedict Arnold. But he'd overseen it, and it was this huge success. And Washington had really struggled in 1776, in 1777, to challenge the British in New England and New York and some of the other spaces around there. So Gates felt that he should be given the command, and that turned pretty ugly and developed into this cabal, as I said, with members of the Continental Congress pushing for Gates to get that role as well. But once Gates was defeated at Camden, that talk died down. However, now Gates, who had not retired and was still in a position of authority with a lot of men up in Newburgh, was kind of stirring up shit again. because he was unhappy about the way things had gone, and he sees an opportunity to push Washington aside and assert his own authority because of all of these disgruntled soldiers who had not received pay for months and officers who likewise had not received pay for months. So he, Gates, starts getting together the beginnings of what could be called a coup in Newburgh. And he, Gates, is encouraged by certain members of the Continental Congress, including Alexander Hamilton and Robert Morris. Hamilton, of course, you know, Robert Morris is less prominent, less famous these days than Hamilton is, for any number of reasons. But Morris was one of the most important founding fathers and a big financier from Philadelphia who is really important in constructing the Constitution and really important in a lot of ways. So he's one of the most profoundly impactful founding fathers. Both Morris and Hamilton agreed that the Confederation Congress was entirely too weak, that the Articles of Confederation as a constitution was insufficient for the needs of the country and would not create a national government that could effectively bind the states together. They, Hamilton and Morris, did not encourage the coup because they were traitors or because they felt that they could better their situation by overthrowing the government and cooperating with Britain or something like that, kind of what Benedict Arnold had done. Both Morris and Hamilton saw their actions as patriotic. Both Morris and Hamilton felt that unless there were radical changes to the government, the United States was not going to survive its independence. There are a lot of kind of wheels in motion here, but Washington and his defenders, and by the way, Hamilton advised Washington about all of this as it was going on, so he wasn't keeping it a secret from Washington, his almost father figure, and the guy to whom he was closely allied. He was, remember, Washington's aide-de-camp during the war. He encouraged Washington to throw in his lot with the Newburgh conspirators because Hamilton felt that if Washington got in behind this army, the government would have no choice but to accede to Washington's demands and to kind of go back to the drawing board and create a stronger version of itself. That's what Hamilton and Morris wanted, and to some degree, it's what Washington wanted, but Washington was not willing to do it this way. In the early months in March of 1783, Washington, having heard about the Newburgh Conspiracy, rides up there with some of his officers. He kind of surprises Gates and the other officers who were leading this meeting to decide what they're going to tell the regular soldiers. Are they going to march on Philadelphia or not? Washington, having caught everyone off guard, demands. He asks, but anything Washington asks is not going to be something that he's denied. Asked to speak to the group, he goes up, he gives this speech. It doesn't really move them. He's pleading with them to obey the rule of law, to not take things into their own hands. He says, I understand your frustration. I am sympathetic to it. I know you've been kind of screwed over, but this is not the way to do this. And apparently the soldiers weren't all that moved from that initial speech. Then Washington brings out a letter that is apparently written in pretty poor handwriting. Because of that, he pulls out these eyeglasses, from his breast pocket, puts them on as he's doing this, because none of the troops had ever seen Washington wear glasses, spectacles in a large group setting. Some of his closer confidants, sure, but this was a big deal for people who were not super close with Washington to see him do this, because it was an admission that he was frail in some way. And that was just not something apparently that guys like Washington made public back in those days. So he takes these glasses out and he says before he begins to read the letter, I'm sorry, gentlemen, I've grown gray and old in your service, and I'm afraid I'm going blind. And that apparently really touched a nerve with a lot of the soldiers who, once Washington finishes reading the letter and walks out of the room, have tears coming down their faces. They're really touched by the fact that their commander-in-chief is willing to be vulnerable with them in this way. And I've read accounts of it that, some historians think it was kind of staged. We don't know exactly. But Washington was really good at commanding a room, and he even chose this particular time to reach out and speak to these people at Newburgh strategically. It was planned out. So it's not unreasonable to think that the pulling out of the glasses and mentioning that he was going blind was an appeal to the pathos of these soldiers. And it worked. And Washington was probably like the only guy in the country that could have pulled something like this off. The soldiers, the officers who are meeting, decide they're not going to march on Philadelphia. The Continental Congress, the Confederation Congress, is able to carry on its business. But what this illustrates is just how fragile things had become in the country. It would only get more tenuous as the following years would unfold under the Articles of Confederation. And I want to relay just some of the difficulties that the young United States was facing as the peace process wrapped up. For one thing, the debt is incredibly onerous. It is estimated that about $40 million was owed, although that is really difficult to be specific and precise about because there were so many forms of debt. There was debt that the national government owed, sure, but there were also debts that the states owed. There were private debts incurred by military commanders. A lot of the requests for these debts were very informal and not very well written out or anything like that. Receipts were shaky. I mean, the paperwork was all pretty chaotic and everything like that. So it's difficult for anyone at any point to calculate all the money that was owed, but it was a lot. And the United States was not in a great position to collect money to pay off that debt because, as we will discuss in a little bit more detail, the national government of the Articles of Confederation could not collect taxes. It had no right to do that. So if you're this national government and you don't have the ability to tax anyone, and all you can do is say, hey, could you give us some money maybe? That doesn't really put you in a great position to pay off any debt that you might have. It's one of the fundamental weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. But as I said, we'll get back to that. Because of this weakness and because the United States was already in all this debt, it was really difficult to get loans from either private creditors or foreign governments. So the debt is a big challenge. There's also the Continental Congress, now the Confederation Congress, was not what it had been. A lot of members had walked away. Thomas Jefferson, by way of example, had left to be governor of Virginia. John Adams had left to go across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe and negotiate peace terms. And that's just two examples I can come up with off the top of my head. A lot of other original members of the Continental Congress, some of the famous founding fathers you think of, had left to help their states out. And so there was just this kind of talent drain that happened. The Confederation Congress was not given the prestige that the Continental Congress had been given in 75-76. So it was difficult to maintain the attention and respect for the national government under the Articles of Confederation that it had had when the Revolution began. On top of that, the states are really suspicious of the national government. They're all looking at it, in a way, not that differently from how they had looked at the British government. And that might seem weird, but it makes sense from their point of view because to them, the state government is the government that matters. That's their home government. That's the one they have greater control over. And one of the lessons for a lot of people, not just people high up in the government, but people all over the newly independent United States, was, you know what, maybe we shouldn't trust powerful foreign governments that are great distances away and that we don't really end up having a lot of influence over. You could see how, with that description, they might look at the national government of the United States, even though it is the United States government and not the British government, in a similar sort of way. Why they would be suspicious of it and why they would not want to share power with it. There are also, as another challenge to the young United States, major territorial disputes, primarily with Spain. The Spanish government are trying desperately to get big chunks of what the British had granted to the United States in the Treaty of Paris. Mostly we're talking about territory that is east of the Mississippi River and west of the Appalachian Mountains. That's what the Spanish are trying to effectively take from the United States. And the The Spanish think, well, it's going to be pretty easy for us to do this. The United States is young and weak, and we can offer people who have come out to this territory already Spanish citizenship, and why wouldn't they want to take advantage of that? So that's one challenge that the United States is facing. There are also jealousies and competition among the various states and regions of the new United States. It's kind of a north versus south versus west kind of a thing, because they all have different interests, many of which are in conflict with one another. And this is a pattern that starts obviously very early in U.S. history, what we call sectionalism. This idea that the United States, as a big country that is diverse and that has a lot of different people in different regions that have different interests that often conflict with one another, struggles to maintain a sense of unity and not to have internal disputes that become very serious. And that is the case immediately after independence, because the Western states want to make sure that they have navigation of the Mississippi open to them. And that's something that the Spanish are trying to shut off. They, the Spanish, want to control the Mississippi. That's vital to people out west, though, because they want to take their goods, whether it's wheat or tobacco or whatever else it is they might raise, and they want to float those goods down the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico and be able to send them either to the East Coast American ports like Philadelphia and New York, or all the way to Europe to market. And so they, in the West, really want control of the Mississippi and want to make sure that that is not abandoned. In the Northeast, they want to make sure that they have access to those rich Atlantic fisheries and that they establish a decent trade relationship with Britain and possibly with Spain. So there's some interest in perhaps giving up on navigation of the Mississippi River. John Jay, in fact, tries to sign a treaty with the Spanish in which we would give up navigation of the Mississippi, control of the Mississippi for 25 years. And that is seen as a reasonable sacrifice because that would then enable us to trade with Spain. And if you're some of these East Coast states, like Massachusetts, like New Hampshire, like New York, you're really interested in being able to trade with Spain. But if you're the Western states, you really want to maintain navigational control of the Mississippi River. So that illustrates the conflicts that are going on, not just between the United States and foreign governments, but between different regions and different states within the United States. And this is something that doesn't really go anywhere, even into the present. So that's a major challenge for the United States. There's also issues with Native Americans, as was the case immediately after the French and Indian War. There are Native Americans who see the independent United States as a threat and try to attack right away to get out ahead of it because they, justifiably and presciently, as we will see, viewed the United States expanding westward as a major threat to their ability to maintain their ancestral lands. Britain closed off the entire United Kingdom and all of its colonies, West Indies most notably, to trade from the United States. Not only that, the British refused to send a minister to establish diplomatic relations with the United States. So even though Britain agreed to give all of this territory all the way out to the Mississippi River to the United States, even though Britain agreed to abandon forts on the west, a lot of British were still pretty freaking bitter about the Revolutionary War defeat, and they were ready to drag their feet and be a pain in the ass as much as they possibly could. It wasn't, in fact, until the early 1790s that we had any kind of real trading or diplomatic relationship with Great Britain. And even then, it wasn't awesome. On top of that, the French government is demanding that the United States start making payments right away. And the French are pretty miffed with us as well. Remember that during the peace process, the Continental Congress / Confederation Congress advised the negotiators to make sure that whatever peace that we achieved with Great Britain would be in harmony with what the French government wanted. But what the French government wanted was a weak and small United States. And so the negotiators, including John Adams, John Jay, and Benjamin Franklin, ended up going through back channels to negotiate with Great Britain and got this separate treaty that was not at all what the French wanted, but was very much what was good for the United States. So the French are not super pleased with the United States at this point, and they are pushing as a result of this kind of strained relationship, to have the money that they lent us repaid as quickly as possible. They're like, fuck you guys, you gotta pay us. Reminds me of Goodfellas, right? Oh, you just finished a Revolutionary War? Fuck you, pay me. Oh, you had get attacked by Indians, huh? Fuck you, pay me. Oh, the British won't let you trade with them, huh? Fuck you, pay me. Because of all of this turmoil, the economy was not in the best of shape. Congress not being able to collect any money to pay off the debt played a role in that. There was economic chaos between all the states because nobody really had authority under the Articles of Confederation to regulate trade between states. States were kind of sorting it out between themselves, and of course, it was almost impossible to sort out how the particulars would go, especially if they disagreed with each other about what was supposed to happen. And the United States had all of the typical economic problems of newly independent or newly created nation states. Inflation was really bad because managing the money system was tricky, and a lot of times people pushed to just start printing money. There was a flood of cheap manufactured goods, which had been held off for a long time as the Revolutionary War was going on from the manufacturing center of the world at that time, Great Britain. Of course, the United States did not have access to British goods in the American market, but once the war is over, now Britain's like, here you go, and starts sending all of this stuff to the United States, which is much cheaper than the goods that the United States is able to produce on its own. That hurts American manufacturers because they just can't compete with the prices that the British can offer. Probably the thing that went smoothest, I would say it didn't even go that smoothly. I would say probably the thing that the United States was able to accomplish most effectively under the Articles of Confederation was land management. And in particular, it's land management of the Trans-Allegheny region. The last step for the Articles of Confederation to be approved by all the states was that Virginia had to give up these pretty ancient claims that the state had had to all of this territory west of the Appalachian Mountains, up to and around the Ohio River Valley. Once Virginia agreed to give up those claims and make that land available to other states or to new states, that's when some of the straggling states who had yet to sign on to the Articles of Confederation agreed to do so. Because now that land was not just going to benefit wealthy, aristocratic Virginia alone. But now there's all this land that's available, and the country has to figure out what to do with it. There is initially an ordinance proposed by Thomas Jefferson in 1784 that gets some support but doesn't ultimately pass. What does ultimately pass is the Land Ordinance of 1785, which described the surveying of the land, how it would be studied and mapped out. Even more importantly than surveying the land and letting everybody know what was out there and what it looked like, the Ordinance of 1785 dictated the way in which land sales would happen in the West and how that money would go toward paying off the national debt, which was really important, as the one reliable way that the national government could get money was to sell Western land to investors or to people who wanted to buy it for their own benefit, to use it rather than just as an investment. And then there's the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It's another really important piece of legislation, and it's the update of the Ordinance of 1784 that I mentioned that Jefferson had put together. It described the process for statehood, what the population requirements would be, how once those requirements and other requirements were achieved, what then a group of people had to do to make a state constitution, submit it for approval, and get the borders and everything all straightened out. And really important for the future development of the United States, the Land Ordinance of 1787 prohibited slavery in the Old Northwest. That is what is today the Midwest. I'm talking about Illinois, Michigan, places like that, Ohio, and so forth. The one exception was if there were slaves already there, then they would be grandfathered in. But no new slaves were to be brought to any of those territories. The United States, at the end of the Revolutionary War, was suffering from a lot of problems. But if we're being real here, a lot of these problems were pretty self-inflicted. Looking at the Articles of Confederation from the benefit of distance, it is a noble first attempt. Also, like a lot of noble first attempts, it was a fucking mess. States were so invested in trying to break away from Great Britain and just getting that much of the thing, the mission, the cause accomplished, that they sort of put on the back burner or de-emphasized how they were all going to coexist when it was over, which is understandable. It's triage. If you have a broken leg, you don't worry so much about perhaps the flu that you might also be coming down with at the same time. And that is the situation of many young governments. But it is important to recognize why the Articles of Confederation did not last and why relatively quickly after the war was over, a lot of people came to the same conclusion, that major changes had to be made if the country was going to survive. So, what did the Articles of Confederation look like? As I have said already in this episode and alluded to in previous episodes, the states were really concerned about recreating the problems as they saw them with their relationship with Great Britain. They did not want to have a strong central government telling them what to do from a distance. The Articles were intended, therefore, to be weak. That is to say, the central government created by the Articles of Confederation was clearly intended to be weak. It is, in the final analysis, one of the only reasons that a lot of the states signed on to this government in the first place. If they had tried during this period, as the war was going on, to make a stronger central government, it stands to reason, based on the evidence, that a lot of states would never have signed on to it. Most people in most states wanted more local government control, not a distant, powerful central government, and many were wary of a return to the Parliament or George III 2.0, if you want to call it that, across demographics. And what I mean by that, mostly, is across classes, whether you're wealthy or middle class or poor, across geographic regions, across different occupational choices, whether you were a merchant or a farmer or a banker or a manufacturer or a blacksmith or whatever, whether you're talking about people on the frontier or people on the seaboard in the cities, whether you're talking about rural people versus urban people, most everyone across all of these demographics wanted a return to the pre-7 Years' War, French and Indian War, whatever you want to call it, dynamic at the end of the Revolution. They wanted things to go back to the way that they had been before the French and Indian War broke out. And if you recall, that meant colonies at that point, now states, doing their own thing and interacting very little and behaving kind of like 13 little islands. That's what a lot of the revolutionary leaders, a lot of the average folks, had in mind for when the war would be over. They thought they could just go back to the way things had been, they were happy that way, and that's how it was all going to work out. But there were a lot of problems with that. And there was just this major, as I've said, distrust, I would call it paranoia, about stronger central government. Because of this experience that the colonists, now Americans, had had with the British government, they were really wary to the point of paranoia about investing greater power in a central government. And the only kind of central government that could really get off the ground during the Revolution was an extremely weak one that couldn't do much of anything. How weak, you might ask? Here's how weak. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no executive branch, okay? Like, no president or anything like a president, because they, the founders and the leaders of the states and the members of the Continental Congress, who all had a voice in creating this thing, did not want anything that would even resemble anything in the same zip code as a George III again. So there was no executive to speak of. Now that creates a serious problem when you're talking about how do the laws and the principles and the policies that this government enacts actually go into effect. I mean, that's what executive branches do. They execute the law that is put into place by the legislature. But if there is no executive, kind of begs the question, who the fuck is actually going to enforce this stuff? The legislature itself was not all that functional. For starters, it couldn't tax. And for those of you who know a thing or two about how government works, almost all of the money that any government across the world whether it is a country's government or a city's government or a county or state or province or whatever the hell, almost all the money that any government uses, any government gets to accomplish whatever it's tasked with accomplishing comes from taxes. So that means if the Articles of Confederation government can't tax, how the hell does it do anything? Governments basically can only do whatever they are legally given the right to do according to the law and what they can pay for. That's what governments are able to accomplish. Whatever they have the legal authority to do and whatever they can pay to do. You want to build a school? Great. Show me the money. You want to fund a war? Great. Show me the money. You got to pay for it. And this government, as I've said already, was in a tremendous amount of debt, and not being able to collect taxes meant it was almost impossible to pay it off. On top of that, the Articles of Confederation government couldn't do anything really significant without either unanimity, which meant all of the delegations from all of the states would have to agree to a particular thing, course of action, law, whatever, or a 9/13 majority. So 9 of the 13 delegations would have to approve of it. In the case of unanimity, that is for amendments. And amendments are a big deal. It means you're making a fundamental change to the government. And so that should be a pretty high bar. But unanimity? I mean, Jesus Christ, you can't get 5 people in a room to agree about what they're going to put on a pizza. You're talking about getting 13 different representatives or legislatures. They're going to agree all in the same law, fundamental change to the Constitution. That ain't going to work. That was a way in which the government was hamstrung. And then 9/13 was required for subjects of importance, according to the Articles of Confederation. And there was no judiciary to speak of. So all of the adjudicating of the law was done at the state level. And all of these different states have different interests. So that got really messy really fast, in addition to an incredibly dysfunctional legislature and a total lack of any executive. So this government was just a Frankenstein's monster of horseshit. I know that sounds maybe a little extreme, but it was just kind of what was clapped together given the circumstances. And the circumstances were that a lot of people didn't really want to do this. They weren't ready. The states were not ready to give up their sovereignty. And it was during a war that was really messy. The actual issue that brought a critical mass of popular outcry amongst especially the leadership classes and the wealthier classes for reform wasn't any of the things that I've mentioned so far, if you can believe it. It was actually something altogether different, and that was the inability of Congress to regulate commerce that went on among the many states, or even just a couple of states. There was no rule in place for who was going to dictate what rules would be in place when business of any kind crossed state lines. And you can see how I think that's a problem. Because if Maryland and Virginia have different takes on how commerce should be done, and they have different laws and different rules, who ends up deciding what applies when business goes from Maryland to Virginia or Virginia to Maryland, or in any other instance where businesses are crossing state lines or any kind of trade is crossing state lines? States were arguing with each other, and businesses were arguing with each other, and legislatures in these different places were fighting like mad about who actually would have the authority in these circumstances. And it just created chaos for anyone trying to make a living at trade. There was a patchwork of tariffs, and this is states putting tariffs on each other. So you can imagine how messy that gets. It just discourages, as tariffs are wont to do, commerce between these different states. There's navigation rules that are in place, and it gets really tricky when you've got, say, a body of water like the Atlantic Ocean, or like any number of rivers that goes through several different states. And all of this disorder, a total lack of central authority, meant economic chaos. And the economy probably would have been in bad shape anyway because of all the debt and because of the necessity to recover from the war. Certainly lots of things were destroyed and lots of people had to put their lives back together, and lots of people left, the loyalists, right? They took off. And some of them were some of the biggest and most successful business people or farmers, and they left. They were like refugees. So that's another complication. All of these different problems with interstate commerce added to the chaos, and the economy suffered really badly because of it. The tax issue, and I should mention, I sort of skipped over this when I was talking about Congress's inability to tax, but just to put some numbers to it, Congress, as it could only request money from the states, was lucky if it got 25% of the money that it requested. And that is why you had soldiers without pay, soldiers without pensions, debts that went unpaid either to private individuals or to financial institutions from the war or to foreign governments. And it made all of those individuals who might want to buy bonds, let's say, from the United States government at the time, really, really wary of doing so. Because why would you, as an investor, want to sink more money into an institution, into a country that appears to have no ability to manage its finances? Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? So the structure of the government just exacerbated all of the problems that already existed. And the economic chaos, the political and military weakness, because of course there were threats, as I've mentioned, and given all these financial troubles, and given the fact that the government couldn't even pay the soldiers it already had used during the Revolutionary War, they certainly didn't have the money to pay soldiers to defend from, say, Native American attacks on the frontier, or pressure from the Spanish or the British on their borders. And there's another component that, again, really kind of pushes the argument for reform forward. And that is what some of the elites, especially some of the leaders in the states and in the Confederation Congress, refer to as the tyranny of democracy. Now that sounds like an oxymoron, like a contradiction in terms. But what they mean when they talk about the tyranny of democracy is this notion that people in the United States, average folks, were feeling themselves in terms of their political power. And you see a lot of this in the states. There's a big difference between, in the states, in the individual states, the number of representatives in the state legislatures. Those numbers expanded a lot from the end of the French and Indian War to the end of the Revolutionary War. You had a lot more representatives in state governments than there were before. And especially, and most importantly, the number of representatives not from the elite classes, average folks who were maybe modest farmers or laborers or had a small business, but were not like the John Hancocks or the Richard Henry Lees or the George Washingtons or the Thomas Jeffersons or whatever of the Revolutionary period. Just people that got involved in the movement, didn't have a lot of money or a prestigious education or whatever, and wanted to be a part of the governments afterward. And that meant that they pushed a lot harder against the elites who had kind of dominated things in the 1760s and 70s and 80s, and pushed for things that those people didn't necessarily think were good ideas, like increasing the amount of paper money available to help average folks who were suffering. Of course, that made a lot of people nervous about inflation. There were even more dramatic instances of democratic tyranny than average folks making their way into the legislatures. There were things like Shays' Rebellion, which happened in 1786-87, kind of concurrently with the coming Constitutional Convention. And Shays' Rebellion was a group of farmers in western Massachusetts, many of whom were Revolutionary War veterans, and were seriously hurt by the economic problems of the post-revolutionary period. Demand was down seriously from the revolution, which, by the way, that's a pretty common historical pattern, is that when wars end, there tends to be an economic decline in a lot of cases because now the government isn't demanding all the stuff that it needs for the war. So demand drops, and the economy takes a hit. That was contributing to the problem as well. And these farmers, because of all the debt issues, because of the soundness of credit overall in the government, and because a lot of people were hurting to try to recover from the revolution, the market just wasn't good for them to sell their stuff. And they couldn't therefore make money, and they couldn't make payments on their mortgages. So a lot of them started getting foreclosed on. That led many of them to say, what the fuck? I fought for this country. I was a part of this revolution. We are a free and independent republic now because of me. And now you're going to say, like, I'm going to have my livelihood upended and my farm foreclosed upon? Fuck that. And so they got together, led by a guy named Daniel Shays, and stormed at least one of the courthouses, I think more than one, that was issuing these foreclosure notices and said, yeah, you're going to stop now. It's vigilante violence, right? I mean, that's what it is. It's people taking the law into their own hands. It's extra legal. And sure, I am sympathetic to where they were coming from. This is kind of where you need government to step in and help people in circumstances like these. But that's just not a thing that happened in the 18th century really much of anywhere. These people were being screwed over by just events turning out the way that they had, and they took the law into their own hands, which was its own problem and made a lot of people really, really, really nervous, afraid, anxious, scared, let's be frank. And this is the tyranny of democracy thing that some are discussing. They're saying that people in the United States have gotten the feeling, they've gotten the sense that they can take the law into their own hands and push the democratic process to a point where it's just mob rule. Eventually, Shays' rebellion was put down, but it was put down by like wealthy dudes who got like a posse together in the state of Massachusetts, not by the national government, because the national government was so weak and crippled financially, it couldn't muster a force together to stop this rebellion. And that was kind of, for a lot of people, the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of trying to change the way that the Articles of Confederation government worked. It's one more thing that makes people say, we really got to do something about this national government, and pushes folks to get together for the Constitutional Convention. And that is where I will start the next time. As always, thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. Hit me up with any comments, suggestions, questions at howthehelldiwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can leave me a voicemail or send me a text message at area code 951-525-5536. Look forward to hearing from you folks. Hope you're enjoying everything so far. Again, this is the stuff that I just love to talk about, so I will get into more of this the next time, and I'll see you then. Take care.